Something nobody tells you about being the guy who keeps the lights on behind the scenes. You don't get a plaque. You don't get a mention in the press release. You get a handshake from someone who's been in the industry 30 years, a nod from a man whose signature can move $100 million, and you just know that the relationship you built over a decade is worth more than any PowerPoint slide anyone will ever make. My name's irrelevant. What matters is that for 19 years, I was the senior compliance and safety liaison at Avex Aviation Systems, a mid-size aerospace contractor out of Dallas. We didn't build the sexy stuff. No fighter jets, no stealth bombers. We built the systems that made sure those things didn't fall out of the sky. Avionics safety protocols. Flight management redundancy architecture. The kind of work where getting it 99% right means someone dies. I had my FAA certifications before most of my colleagues had their first real job. I'd been on site during 3 major incident investigations, testified twice before the National Transportation Safety Board, and spent 4 years embedded with a regional carrier in Phoenix, helping them overhaul their maintenance compliance program after a near miss that should have been a catastrophe. When I came back to Avex, I came back as the guy you called when things were about to go sideways. The CEO at the time, a man named Gordon, old-school Texas Aerospace, the kind of guy who wore the same boots every day for 15 years, used to say I was the institutional memory of the company. I didn't have the title, I didn't have the corner office, but I had the phone numbers that mattered, and I knew which ones to call in what order when the FAA came knocking. That was my value. Not a degree on a wall. 19 years of knowing exactly where everybody was buried, every protocol was documented, every relationship was maintained. Then Gordon retired. His replacement was a man named Clifford, brought in from outside the industry, which should have been the first warning sign. Clifford had an MBA from Wharton, a background in logistics optimization, and the kind of confidence that comes from never having been in a room where the stakes were actually life and death. He was sharp, I'll give him that. Numbers, margins, operational efficiency. He could run circles around most people, but aerospace safety compliance isn't logistics optimization. The FAA doesn't care about your efficiency metrics. The NTSB doesn't grade on a curve. Clifford had a daughter. Her name was Sloan. Sloan had just finished her MBA at Northwestern. 28 years old, sharp as her father in some ways. Quick with data, confident in presentations, the kind of person who could walk into a room and own it within 10 minutes. She'd done a summer internship at a consulting firm that had once done a peripheral project with a regional airline, which in Clifford's mind apparently qualified her to lead our regulatory compliance division. I want to be fair to Sloan. She wasn't incompetent in a general sense. She was incompetent in a very specific, very dangerous sense. She didn't know what she didn't know. And in our industry, that gap between confidence and competence is exactly where accidents are born. The first 6 months I tried. I genuinely tried. I sat in on her briefings. I flagged the things that needed flagging. I explained, as patiently as I could, why certain FAA documentation cycles existed the way they did, why the relationship with our primary audit inspector, a man named Dwayne, 22 years with the agency, stationed out of the Fort Worth SDO, was not something you could automate or abbreviate. Dwayne had personally signed off on Avex's last 3 major certifications. He knew our systems. He knew our people. That trust was not a given. It was built. Sloan's response, delivered with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, was that she appreciated my institutional knowledge but felt the division needed to modernize its relationship management approach. She brought in a vendor, some tech platform out of Austin, that promised to digitize compliance tracking, automate documentation submissions, and, I am quoting directly here, streamline stakeholder relationship touchpoints through AI-driven communication protocols. I asked what that meant in plain English. She said it meant they were going to use software to maintain contact with regulatory contacts rather than relying on individual relationship dependencies. I looked at her for a long moment. Then I said, Sloan, Dwayne has my cell number. When there's a problem at 2 in the morning, he calls me. Not the company mainline. Me. You cannot automate that. She thanked me for my perspective. 3 weeks later, I found out she'd already gone above my head to Clifford and gotten approval to implement the platform on a trial basis for the upcoming Southwest Regional Audit cycle. The cycle that, if passed, would unlock a $640 million contract renewal with one of the largest regional carriers in the country. I sent Clifford a memo, detailed, 6 pages, documented every specific risk, every protocol that required personal certification from a named individual, every relationship-dependent process that the platform could not replicate. I wasn't political about it, I just laid out the facts. Clifford sent back a 2-line response thanking me for my thoroughness and letting me know the decision had been made, and he was confident in Sloan's leadership. I read that email 3 times, then I printed it out and put it in a folder I labeled Documentation. I kept adding to that folder over the next 4 months. The audit cycle began in February. I was, officially, still on the compliance team, but Sloan had quietly shifted my responsibilities to what she called a senior advisory function, which meant I attended meetings, was rarely asked to speak, and watched as the Austin platform sent automated check-in emails to Dwayne's office inbox while Sloan's team presented dashboards showing relationship health scores for each of our regulatory contacts. I want you to understand what that looks like from the inside. You're watching someone replace a handshake and the decade of trust with a software metric. And you know with absolute certainty that when the moment comes, that metric is going to be worth nothing. The moment came in March. It wasn't dramatic at first. Dwayne's office sent back a documentation request, standard pre-audit protocol, asking for certification records on our new integrated avionics monitoring system, the IMS-7, which we'd rolled out across the client fleet the previous fall. Normal request. I'd have had it compiled and personally delivered within 48 hours. The platform flagged it as a routine documentation request, auto-generated a response acknowledging receipt, and routed it to Sloan's team for processing. Sloan's team, following the platform's workflow, submitted the documentation package digitally 3 days later. The package was missing 17 pages, not because the information didn't exist, because the platform's document mapping hadn't been calibrated to account for a supplemental certification protocol that had been added by the FAA as a bulletin update 8 months prior. I knew about the bulletin. I had the documentation. Nobody had told the software. Dwayne's office sent a follow-up. The platform auto-acknowledged it and routed it back through the same workflow. Sloan's team resubmitted. Still missing 11 pages because the second submission had been generated from the same incomplete template. By the time I found out, not because anyone told me, but because Dwayne called my cell phone directly, something he hadn't done in 4 months. The FAA's Fort Worth office had escalated the incomplete submission to a formal deficiency notice. I listened to Dwayne's voice on the phone. He wasn't angry. He was something worse than angry. He was disappointed. "I've been waiting for someone to call me," he said. "I sent 3 responses through whatever system you got set up now. Nobody called." I told him I understood. I told him I was going to find out what happened and call him back within the hour. I walked directly into Sloan's office. She was in a meeting with 2 members of her team, reviewing the platform's dashboard metrics. I said, "We have a formal deficiency notice from FAA Fort Worth. The audit is at risk. I need the full documentation file for IM7 right now." She looked at me the way people look at someone who's just interrupted something important with something they don't believe is actually important. "The platform shows the submission was completed," she said. "The platform is wrong," I said. "Dwayne just called me directly. He hasn't been able to reach anyone. We're missing supplemental certification records from FAA Bulletin 2024, AFS 19. She pulled up the platform on her laptop, showed me the green check marks. All documents submitted, all stakeholder touchpoints logged, relationship health score for our FAA contacts 83 out of 100. I said, "Sloan, a formal deficiency notice is not consistent with an 83 health score. The platform doesn't know what it doesn't know." She said she'd have her team look into it. I went back to my desk and spent the next 4 hours pulling every document, cross-referencing the FAA bulletin, and compiling the complete corrected package myself. I emailed Clifford, Sloan, and the General Counsel simultaneously. I attached the formal deficiency notice, the bulletin, and the corrected package. I laid out exactly what had gone wrong, step by step, without editorializing. Then I called Dwayne back. I told him I had the complete package ready. I told him I was sorry for the confusion, and that I was personally handling the resubmission. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I figured you'd call." We got the corrected submission in that day. The deficiency notice was resolved. The audit proceeded. But here's what happened next, and this is the part I want you to understand. Clifford called me into his office 2 days later. I assumed it was to discuss how we'd course corrected. Instead, he told me that my intervention in the compliance process had created confusion and undermined Sloan's authority with her team. He said I should have routed my concerns through Sloan rather than going directly to Dwayne and copying the general counsel. I asked him if he'd read the timeline in my email. He said he had. I asked him if he understood that by the time I intervened, we already had a formal deficiency notice and the audit was 12 days out. He said he appreciated my dedication, but felt my approach had been disruptive. I told him I understood his concern. What I understood was something different. I understood that I was watching a man protect his daughter's authority at the expense of the company's most important regulatory relationship. I understood that my 19 years of institutional knowledge was now a threat to someone's org chart. And I understood, with the clarity that only comes from having been through real crises, that this was not going to end well. 2 weeks after the audit, which we passed, barely, largely because Dwayne gave us more latitude than we deserved, which he did because of 19 years of trust that no software had built. Clifford called me into his office again. This time there was an HR representative in the room. They called it a role elimination. The senior advisory function was being restructured. My position was being absorbed into a general compliance analyst pool. They offered me a severance package, 8 weeks, full benefits through the end of the quarter. For 19 years, I didn't say anything dramatic. I didn't raise my voice. I looked at Clifford and I said, I hope the decisions made in the past few months serve the company well. Then I signed the paperwork, packed my office, and drove home. My wife met me at the door. She took one look at my face and said, "Tell me everything." I sat at the kitchen table and told her everything. She listened to the whole thing without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "So what do you do now?" I told her I was going to take 2 weeks, and then I was going to make some phone calls. I had 19 years of phone calls. I had 19 years of phone numbers. The first call I made after 2 weeks was to a man named Archie. Archie ran a boutique aerospace safety consulting firm out of Denver. 3 people, serious reputation, the kind of outfit that got called in when carriers or manufacturers needed independent compliance expertise they couldn't build internally. We'd known each other for 12 years. He tried to recruit me twice. I told him I was available. He said, "How soon can you start?" Within 6 weeks of leaving Avex, I was billing at a rate that was 1/3 higher than my salary had been, working on a project for a cargo carrier that needed independent safety systems review before a major FAA certification push. I wasn't looking over my shoulder. I wasn't managing platform dashboards. I was doing the work I actually knew how to do for people who understood what it was worth. It was Archie who texted me 4 months after I left Avex with a news link and a message that just said, "Saw this. Thought of you." It was an industry trade publication, Aviation Week. The headline was about Avex and a formal FAA compliance review that had been initiated following concerns raised during a subsequent audit cycle. A different audit, a different regional carrier, but the same compliance division. I won't pretend I felt nothing reading that. I'm human. There was something, not satisfaction exactly, but the particular feeling of having been right in a way you never wanted to be right. I heard through a mutual contact about a month after that Clifford had quietly departed Avex to pursue other opportunities. I heard that Sloan's compliance division had been restructured and that a search was underway for a new senior compliance director. I also heard, and this part I didn't expect, that Dwayne from the Fort Worth FSDO had made a comment during the review process that the agency had noticed a significant deterioration in the quality and responsiveness of Avex's compliance communications over the past year. and had noted specifically that the company appeared to have moved away from its previously strong relationship-based compliance practices. I don't know if anyone at Avex connected the dots back to a specific decision made 18 months prior, but I know the dots were there to connect. A few months later, I was having coffee with a former colleague from Avex, a good engineer named Pemberton, one of the few people who'd sent me a private message when I left saying he was sorry to see me go. He told me that the new compliance director they'd brought in was methodical, experienced, had come up through the FAA field offices before moving to private sector. Someone who understood that in regulatory compliance, the relationship is the protocol. I raised my cup. Good, I said. That's exactly who they need. Pemberton looked at me over his coffee. You're not even a little bitter. I thought about that for a moment. 19 years, 8 weeks severance, a formal deficiency notice that almost took down a $640 million contract because nobody called Dwayne back. No, I said, I'm really not, and I meant it, because here's what I've learned. After 2 decades in a field where the margin between okay and catastrophic is measured in millimeters and milliseconds, the work protects itself. You can try to automate trust. You can try to replace relationships with dashboards and health scores and AI-driven communication protocols. You can eliminate the people who built those relationships and call it modernization. But when something goes wrong, and in this industry, something always eventually goes wrong, the system doesn't call the software. The system calls the person who picked up the phone at 2 in the morning for 19 years. I picked up every time. Last fall, I was speaking on a panel at an aviation safety conference in Nashville. The topic was regulatory relationship management in an era of digital compliance tools. After the panel, a young woman came up to me, maybe 26, 27, sharp-eyed, wearing a lanyard from a regional carrier I recognized. She said she'd just started in a compliance role and wanted to know the one thing she should understand going in. I thought about Sloan, and her dashboards. I thought about the green check marks that meant nothing. I thought about Dwayne's voice on the phone, saying he'd been waiting for someone to call. I told her, the relationships you build in this industry are not soft skills. They are load-bearing structures. Treat them that way. She wrote it down. I watched her walk away and thought about the fact that 19 years from now, she might be the person someone calls at 2 in the morning. I hope whoever she works for is smart enough to know what that's worth before they find out the hard way. Some companies learn that lesson in a memo. Some learn it in a trade publication headline. And some, if they're lucky, learn it before someone gets hurt. Avex learned it somewhere in between. I hope it was worth it. I know my part of that story was. I've thought a lot about what actually happened at Avex. Not the professional mechanics of it, but the human part. Why Clifford made the choices he made. Why Sloan was so certain. Why nobody in that building, aside from Dwayne calling my cell at the 11th hour, stopped to ask whether the system they'd built could actually carry the weight they were putting on it. I don't think any of them were bad people. That's the part that took me a while to sit with, honestly. Clifford wasn't malicious. He was a man who'd succeeded in one world and assumed that success transferred cleanly into another. Sloan wasn't reckless for the sake of it. She was ambitious and confident and surrounded by people who told her she was right. Neither of them woke up one morning and decided to put a $640 million contract at risk. They made a series of small decisions that each felt reasonable in isolation, and those decisions accumulated into something that nearly came apart at the seams. That's how it usually works. Not one catastrophic choice, 100 small ones that nobody stops to question because questioning them would mean admitting something uncomfortable, that the old way existed for a reason, that the person who built it knew something the dashboard didn't. That experience isn't a liability to be managed around, but a resource you lose at your own peril. What I keep coming back to is the ethics of it. Not in a legal sense, nobody broke a law. But there's an ethical dimension to how we treat institutional knowledge, and I think we don't talk about that enough. When you eliminate the person who knows where every load-bearing beam is hidden, you don't just lose their skills. You lose the accumulated judgment of 2 decades of being wrong, correcting course, learning, and being right in ways you can't fully explain to someone who wasn't there. That knowledge belongs to the organization. Discarding it carelessly isn't just poor management, it's a kind of negligence. Sloan will figure that out eventually. I genuinely believe that. She's sharp enough to look back at what happened and understand it differently at 40 than she did at 28. The question is whether the lesson costs something or costs someone else something. In our case, we got lucky. The deficiency notice was resolved. The audit passed. Nobody got hurt. In aviation compliance, that's not always the outcome when you get it wrong. The resilience part, the part I'm most grateful for, wasn't something I planned. It was just the habit of doing the work every day for 19 years. Archie called back. The cargo carrier project materialized. The consulting work grew, not because the universe rewarded me for being right, but because I had spent 2 decades building something real, and real things don't disappear when someone eliminates a job title. What I tell younger people now is simple. Build things that can survive the org chart changing. Build relationships that aren't contingent on your employer. Build knowledge that lives in you, not in a platform someone else controls. Those are the only assets that truly belong to you. And if someone tells you that what you've built is outdated, that trust is inefficient, that relationships are a dependency risk, that 19 years is less valuable than a fresh perspective, smile. Clean out your desk and give it about 90 days. The work tells the truth. It always does, eventually. Your only job is to still be standing when it does.